Hello friends, and welcome to the Southern Mountain Kitchen. Today we're making iced oatmeal cookies. So everything you see on my counter is what we're going to use to make the cookie part of this recipe. If you look at the oats I have regular instant oats that I'm going to be using, and they're kind of large in size. If you choose that you want your cookies to be a little bit more smaller oat size, you could put this through a food processor before you start to chop them up and make them a little smaller. It's your choice. It's kind of like a personal preference. If you want them smaller, chop them up. Otherwise, I find that when you bake them in the cookie, you really don't taste anything on the size of the oat anyway. And another thing, once we mix this up, it's going to have to be refrigerated for about 3 hours before you bake it. But when we do get to baking, you're going to bake at 350 degrees for 10 to 12 minutes for the load of cookies. So, that being said, let's go ahead and get started with what we're doing here. The first thing we're putting into our bowl is a half a cup of granulated sugar, then 1 cup of brown sugar. To this, we are going to add in a whole cup of unsalted butter that's been softened. Make sure we get all of that in there. And then we're going to have 2 large eggs. These are going to be at room temperature. You want to let them sit out for a little bit before you use them. Go ahead and break up the yolk of the egg. And then we're going to add a teaspoon of vanilla extract. Now, once we get this all into the bowl, we're going to mix it up a bit, because we want to kind of like get everything a little bit incorporated before we bring the mixer into play. I do this sometimes just because I have a habit with a hand mixer of throwing stuff all over the counter. So at least this way I get a little mixed up before I hit the mixer. And then once the mixer is in play and everything is staying in the bowl, which is miraculous for me because, I'll throw it anywhere when I'm doing this. We're going to go ahead and mix this until this is really soft and fluffy, and we want to make sure that if there are any like lumps from the butter, we're breaking those up, or anything from the sugar or whatever, because sometimes there are lumps in your sugar and this will break it up, because you're going to do this for a couple minutes. You just want to make sure you get completely through all of it and go all the way to the bottom of your bowl and around the sides and pull everything in, because we want to get this really mixed together and make sure that the egg is completely mixed in and all. So I suggest doing it for at least 2 or more minutes just to make sure you get it there. But once you do get it done, you're going to have this really nice fluffy looking cloud of ingredients that are ready for when we go to the dry mixture. So just keep going. Now mind you, when we mix the next part together, this is where we're going to get to the oats and flour and everything else that's going to go in that way. So as you can see in my bowl, mine is actually fluffing up quite nicely. I'm not really seeing many lumps in it. So it's time to go ahead and do the next part. So we have 2 cups of old-fashioned rolled oats, 2 cups of all-purpose flour, and then to this we're going to add 1 teaspoon of baking soda, and a teaspoon of salt, 2 teaspoons of cinnamon, and a half a teaspoon of ground nutmeg. And once we get this all in there, we're going to use a whisk to mix this up, because we want to make sure that all of the spices and everything kind of like just mix through, so that way they are completely through the oats, the flour, and everything is kind of mixed together before we start moving this over to the wet ingredients. So go ahead and just mix this through. Make sure you get all the way to the bottom of the bowl, and just take a second and make sure it's really incorporated, especially for the fact that we put salt in here, because we really want to make sure that's pulled in. And I know it sounds weird, you're putting salt in a cookie, but it is necessary. So when we go to mix this into the wet ingredients, we're only going to put about half in at a time. It's just a little easier to mix that way, and you just keep pulling it in as you're mixing it up until you get this first part completely wet, and then bring your other half into it, just for the fact that it's easier to mix up rather than dumping that whole bowl of dry ingredients into your wet and trying to make them all mix together at once, because sometimes it's a pain to get it to do. So it's just easier to do it half and half. But as I said before, once we get this completely mixed up, we're going to cover it in plastic wrap and then put it in the refrigerator for about 3 hours. You could leave it overnight if you wanted, that's totally up to you. But you need this to actually be left in there for a while because this mixture is a little on the wet side, but it's supposed to be. And what we want to do is get this refrigerated so that way it's a little more solid and easier to work with. Because when we bake these cookies up, they're going to be really soft and really chewy to eat. They're not going to be like hard cookies. I didn't want hard cookies out of this mix because I wanted more of a fluffier kind of cake-like cookie. So we're just going to go ahead and mix this up, cover it in plastic wrap, and after 3 hours, this is mine coming back. And as you can see, it is there, it is set up, and it is scoopable, and I'm using like a medium-sized scoop to do this. So we're going to use a pan and put some parchment paper on it, and then we're just going to go ahead and put these on, leaving a little room in between, because when these cook, they do spread out a little bit. We don't want them touching each other. So we're going to do our best to keep them separated by, you know, a couple inches to make sure that they work perfectly well for that. But as I said before, preheat your oven to 350 degrees because these will be in there up to 12 minutes to make sure they're done. Just look around the edges to see if they're starting to get kind of like golden brown, and if they are, that means you're pretty much there. And just go ahead and scoop these out and put them all across your pan. This dough is really easy to work with, so it's not like it's a chore to have to deal with any of it. It just basically scoops and you drop it, you're done, and you're ready to go for the oven when you fill up your pan. And when they came back from the oven, I had multiple pans, so I kind of pushed these all together to cool, because they need to cool before we get to the icing, or else your icing isn't going to work. So give them about 20 minutes to cool before you get with icing or anything on top, because the icing would melt right off if you didn't. So we're going to mix up our icing now. We have 1.5 cups of powdered sugar. To this, we are going to add 2 tablespoons of milk and 1/4 teaspoon of vanilla extract. Now, when you mix this up, what you're going for is kind of a wet icing. If yours isn't wet enough as far as like it's really dry and really hard, you can add some more milk to it. It really doesn't matter how much you put in as long as you get it to the consistency that you want. I wanted mine to a point where it was wet but not runny wet. You want it to be to a point where it's like an icing. This is going to set up once it sits. As it cools down and dries out, it's going to actually become solid. But if you can look at the consistency in mine, this is what you're going for. It's not like a cake icing, but it's a little bit more wet, and that way once you get it completely mixed up like this, you're in business. But go ahead and keep mixing with your spoon and keep going through your bowl to make sure that when you put in the powdered sugar, there were no lumps of powdered sugar that are sticking together. And then when you're done, you're going to take your cookie and actually with your fingers just run it across the top of the icing and go from side to side and move it around. And if you don't get enough on it, you can always take your spoon and add some into the center. And that's what I do sometimes, just to make sure it's completely coated on top. Sometimes you'll move it through the bowl and you'll get it completely right. Sometimes it doesn't always stay the right way because there are ridges in the tops of the cookies that don't always catch all of the icing. So just go ahead and keep adding on top of each one of the cookies until you get them all done. And just go through all of them, because it's going to take a minute to go through and ice all these cookies you're going to get out of this, because there's going to be quite a few. Because if I'm not mistaken, there's about like maybe 16 or 18 cookies out of this when you're done. And when they're finished, they look something like this. And these have the best taste. The icing is wonderful and the cookies are just a joy to eat. I hope you liked this video. If you did, please like and subscribe. And if you get a moment, take a look at my cookbooks, which are available in bookstores worldwide. The first is about everyday cooking. The second is all about baking. Have a great day.